This is a lecture on Marcel Proust's Swann's Way. I've divided the lecture into three parts, and the first part will deal with the Combray section, and so will the second part. The third part will deal with the section of Swann's Way entitled Swann in Love. Now, our goal here is this is an introductory lecture for those who are unfamiliar with Proust, and particularly for those who struggle to read Proust. I've taught Proust in my classes for a number of years, and I've had very similar kinds of experiences from students who have come to this text and have struggled with it. And yet, those who have struggled with it and persisted have come to really love the text. It's a text that many readers treasure, although it does provide certain challenges to you as a reader, particularly if you're coming to it for the first time. And part of the reason for this is Proust's very long sentences. So what we're going to see, I'll read you excerpts from the text that we'll look at and study carefully in these three lectures. But I do give you a fair warning that his sentences are very long, and so one must be patient. But if one, as I've said to my students over the years many times, if one puts in the work to understand the writings of Proust, it's indeed a very enjoyable and rewarding experience. Some consider Proust to be the greatest novelist who ever lived. I once had a professor who described him to me as, he says, Proust is to the novel what Shakespeare is to theater. And I think that's not, there might be writers that others, or novelists that others prefer, but I think that's not an inaccurate description. Proust is indeed a very great writer and a very rewarding writer to read. And so it's one reason why so many readers have found him to be enjoyable and rewarding. And yet, there is a little bit of work that you have to do first to gain access to this text. And so what I'm seeking to do here is to help beginning writers gain access to a rewarding but difficult text. Now, in the image that you see, this is an image from the village of Illiers-Combray, which is in France. Now, this is the village where Marcel Proust grew up, which was named while he grew up Illiers, but later, in his novel, he calls Illiers-Combray, and so later they actually, the citizens of Illiers changed the name of the town and hyphenated it, so now it's Illiers-Combray. And this is the square very close to the house where Marcel Proust grew up and lived. You can see there to the left the church that he writes about so lovingly. And so I was actually recently in Illiers-Combray, and so I took a number of pictures there, and I'll use some of these pictures to illustrate for you the surroundings that Proust is describing in Swann's Way. Now, this is not strictly speaking. There's a very important passage in the text where Proust emphasizes in a very strong way that this is a fictional work, and yet as a fictional work, it is a work that is very certainly tied to the life of Marcel Proust and to his family members and to a very particular village. And so we're going to see that in many cases, the images that I'll show you mirror very closely the descriptions that Proust has of his town and of his parents in France, just a little bit south of Paris. Here you can see, here's a map which will show you where Illiers-Combray is. You can see that if you look and see on the left, you see Paris, and then a little further south and to the west, you can see the marker on the map. It's about a 2-hour, maybe 2-hour train ride from Paris to Illiers. It's actually also Chartres is the famous Cathedral of Chartres is on the way in the village, so it makes a nice day trip. You can start in Paris, stop and see the magnificent cathedral in Chartres, and then go on to Illiers-Combray and come back that same evening. But this is on the right. You can see a little map that this is a photograph of a map that I took in Illiers-Combray, which identifies many of the places that Marcel Proust writes about in his novel. And if you go visit the town, you can go and see some of these same sites. Now, I'll just draw your attention to two sites, and we'll come back to this. Is the Côté de chez Swann at the bottom there. This is the Swann's Way, or the path to the house of Mr. Swann or Mr. Swann. And then at the top, the Côté de Guermantes. Now, this is the path to the house of the aristocracy, the way of the Guermantes. And these are two trails or walking paths that Marcel in the novel takes as a young boy, and they become metaphors in effect for paths in life that also he'll consider taking as well. So much of what is established here in the beginning of this wonderful, very lengthy 3,000-page novel, and we're only going to be looking at the first installment of this 3,000-page novel, but with the goal of providing a foundation so that readers can then go out and enjoy and experience the text for themselves without any guidance. But in this wonderful 3,000-page novel, the beginning section of it, the opening part of it, is lays out many of the foundations for what will later become themes, motifs that run through the entire text. And one of the most important themes is this idea of these two ways or these two paths. The path of Monsieur Swann, which also his family calls the Mes Églises way, and we'll see that Mes Églises, and translated into English is the way of our church, the path of our church. This is linked to the idea of the path of the sacred, of the family, of what is holy to young Marcel. And then the path of Guermantes, which is the more path of social climbing, his desire to ascend in the world and mingle with the aristocracy and have a place in high society. And these are these two paths that he wrestles with and takes in the novel, only to find later that they are indeed one and the same path. But this is something that as a young boy, it's too difficult for him to reconcile in his mind. But he does finally reconcile the differences between these two paths and two ways, which finally we're going to see for him become one path and one way. So again, the first part of it now in the Scott Moncrieff translation, which we're going to be looking at, he's going to call the opening section of Swann's Way overture. It's not in the original text, but I think it's an apt way of describing, what happens in that beginning section of Swann's Way, because it really does. It is indeed like an overture for a symphony. You get many of the main themes, motifs introduced, and then we have variations on these same themes throughout the rest of the indeed 3,000-page novel. So that's one of the reasons why it's usually a good idea to take some time and look very carefully at these opening passages, and that's what we're going to do. So here's, as you can see, a painting of Marcel Proust. This painting hangs in the Musée d'Orsay in Paris. He also is buried in the Père Lachaise cemetery in Paris. You can visit both of those places should you go there. You can see he lived from 1871 to 1922, right in the period of what is often referred to as La Belle Époque, or the beautiful era in France, a time of great wealth and prosperity. Now, his parents were wealthy members of the bourgeoisie, so they had a great deal of money, and they weren't members themselves of the aristocracy, but they were on the cusp of it. And you see young Marcel wanting to, idolizing the members of the aristocracy and wanting to become a part of that world. This is one of the themes that will be developed later in the narrative. Now, the French title is À la recherche du temps perdu, which is in the most recent translation is translated as In Search of Lost Time. Scott Moncrieff translated it as Remembrance of Things Past, from a sonnet by Shakespeare. That's not really an accurate translation of the title. In Search of Lost Time is the correct or more accurate translation of the title. Or at least it doesn't take the kind of liberties that the Moncrieff title does. And so after the Moncrieff translation was published, the restored translation or the restored title occurred in the Terence Kilmartin revision of the Moncrieff text. Now there are 7 volumes in this rather massive novel, so it is indeed quite a commitment of time to read it. But again, it's a very rewarding experience. I had another actually professor who once said he was always reading Proust. He's always, his whole life, he's somewhere in Proust. And one can indeed read Proust over and over again and do so with pleasure. Now, you can see if you look at Proust's features, now Proust's mother was from a Jewish family. His father was not. He was raised a Catholic in a mixed family, and part of his Jewish heritage led him, even though he was, in terms of religion, was Catholic in his outlook, he was Jewish, or at least part Jewish, ethnically speaking, and this led him, for instance, to become a fervent supporter, as was Émile Zola of Dreyfus during the famous Dreyfus affair in France in the late 19th century, who was a general in the army who was accused falsely of treason, but it was in fact an incidence of anti-Semitism, and so Proust became an ardent defender of Dreyfus, as did Zola. Now, here's an image of Scott Moncrieff, the original translator, who lived from 1889 to 1930. He was Scottish. He had exchanged some correspondence with Marcel Proust. He was an interesting figure in his own right. Now later, Terence Kilmartin in 1981 will come along and offer a corrected version of the text, which will then go through another revision by D.J. Enright in 1992. I'm going to be working with the original Moncrieff translation in these lectures, which is in public domain. However, generally speaking, I do feel that you're probably better off going with the Kilmartin Enright corrected version. But there are some. I think the Moncrieff translation is rightly celebrated as a very fine translation, and there are some changes that Kilmartin makes that, in my view, are arbitrary. But in any case, either way, you can't go wrong. But the more canonical today translation is the one that has gone through these corrections of Kilmartin and Enright. Now, let's just putting this in historical context. I said Proust is a writer of La Belle Époque, and he was a contemporary of many famous Impressionist painters and artists. And he lived at a time of great opulence and wealth. And so, but we don't want to forget the fact that this occurred, that the wealth that young Marcel enjoyed, and that older Marcel, and I say that because it's Marcel Proust, but the main character of the novel is also named Marcel. We never learn his last name, but the wealth that he enjoyed that enabled him to lead such a life of aesthetic pleasures that are described in the narrative was due in large measure to French imperialism. Now you can see there on the map in the blue the parts of Africa that were colonized by the French. The dark blue parts there you see in the dark blue are the French colonies, and it was Frantz Fanon who famously said that Europe is literally the creation of Africa. Well, there is a sense in which that is true. If you walk the streets to Paris today, you just see these overwhelmingly beautiful and amazing cultural monuments, but built with the spoils of colonial plunder and imperialism. And so, Frederick Jameson makes the observation that one of the defining features of the modern novel, of which we can certainly include Marcel Proust, is that in an existential sense, the reality of one's daily lived existence is often not clear to those who are experiencing this tremendous and opulent wealth. Now, the canonical example of this is of course, in Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, when Marlowe comes back from his travels to the Belgian Congo, which was colonized by King Leopold of Belgium at that time, and he has, he's been there and he's found this renegade, European man named Kurtz, who has done all these terrible things in the interior of Africa, literally made himself into a kind of a beast. But when Marlowe goes back and meets the fiancée of Kurtz, whom he calls, whom Conrad names in the narrative the intended, Marlowe does not ever reveal to her or disclose to her the truth about what her fiancé was actually doing in the Congo. Now, there's a wonderful Jane Austen novel as well, Mansfield Park, that follows the same kind of theme. But I think it's worth. This lecture is not going to focus on the question of colonialism. We're more dealing with the issue of La Belle Époque. But let's bear that in mind, because this is also simultaneously the moment of French colonial conquest. That as Marcel is enjoying himself in Paris, the French are marching on Timbuktu, Ségou, Djenné, and so on. Okay, so here are the 7 volumes of In Search of Lost Time. You can see here the different titles of them. The one we're going to be looking at, Volume 1, Swann's Way, which was published in 1919. Now, this novel has within it inserted a novel within a novel, which is really unlike anything else that appears in the rest of this great novel. So this is a kind of an insert that Marcel Proust sets into the novel about the love affair of Charles Swann, who is a family friend, from whom the path of Swann's Way is named, that I mentioned previously, and he falls in love with a courtesan named Odette, and Proust tells us the story of Swann, which is fascinating. Oftentimes, Swann in Love is read as a novel in and of itself, and it's certainly worth reading just for itself. But what's interesting about the novel, within the novel that Proust places in Swann's Way, is that it really prefigures the story of Marcel, who is the narrator of all 7 of these volumes. And so, in effect, the story of Charles Swann it parallels in a very close way the story of young Marcel and his when he himself falls in love with a young girl named Albertine. And so the story of Swann effectively foreshadows the story of young Marcel. And this is a novel about love, about being in love, and about jealousy and the obsession that being in love can cause. And these are some of the themes. There are a number of themes, but this is one of the most important themes of the narrative. And so that when the novel begins, the first novel, we start with young Marcel, and he is laying in his bed in Combray. Although, as we're going to see, it's not really altogether clear that if it is the young Marcel or not. I'll address that in just a minute. But the young Marcel is laying in bed, and he wakes up, and then he has, he interacts with his parents, and he's learning about the world in Combray, and then we switch to the narrative of Swann's story about his love for Odette, and then at the end of Volume 1 we go back to the story of young Marcel, and then the rest of the narratives carry through and tell us this. Then it becomes all about the story of Marcel, and Swann appears in the other narratives as well, but he is a secondary character in the other narratives. Now, in the second volume, which was published in 1919, In the Shadow of Young Girls in Flower, this is young Marcel, who's now going through adolescence. So if the first volume deals with his childhood, his very young childhood, and the second volume deals with his adolescence when he is associating or hanging out with a group of young girls who are also going through adolescence at the beach, and he's having a wonderful time. He's in love with all of them. But then his love interest narrows down to one particular girl who is Albertine, and then she becomes his main love interest throughout the narrative. Now, in volume 3, The Guermantes Way, this is young Marcel now is like Swann, who was a social climber as well. Young Marcel is finding his way through society and following the path of prestige and social mobility. Then in the fourth novel, Sodom and Gomorrah, this deals with the theme of sexual promiscuity that he observes as he's growing up, or as he's a young adult, and then in his society that he observes. And then in volume 5, The Prisoner, this is where this is published in 1923, and like Charles Swann, who becomes obsessed with Odette and tortures her with his jealousy and the questions that he's always posing to her, young Marcel, in effect, imprisons Albertine. She becomes his prisoner, his prisoner whom he loves and can't bear to be parted with. And then in volume 6, she runs away. This is the novel The Fugitive, and much as Odette runs away, in effect, from Swann when she goes on a lengthy tour with the Verdurins. And then the final volume, Time Regained, published posthumously in 1927, is the volume in which, what happens here is very similar to what happened to Marcel Proust in his own life, is that he became quite sick and went to a sanatorium in Switzerland. And then when he came back after being gone for a number of years, he saw many of the people whom he'd known as a younger man, and he was shocked to see how much they had aged. Now, one of the themes of the novel, in effect, this is a kind of a novel about writing novels, in the sense that young Marcel, we see in volume 1, he wants to be a writer. He wants to write a great novel. He wants to be one of the great writers of his day. It's his ambition, but he doesn't believe in himself, and so he has a sort of a crisis of self-confidence, and so this is one of the reasons why he begins to pursue social climbing and a life of social prestige, because he just thinks he doesn't really he doesn't have the talent, or he doesn't believe that he has enough talent to become a writer. So he gives up his ambitions. But in the final novel, Time Regained, when he sees everybody who's aging, he suddenly has this awareness of the passing of time. And like many of us, he's been living his life every day, totally oblivious to the fact that time is passing. Now, the passing of time also means the passing of our own time, and the fact that we all age, we all get older, we all eventually die. And so he has this sudden awareness of his own temporality, of his own limited time that remains to him. And so volume 7, he in effect, he says that he rushes back to his room and he decides that he's going to write this novel after all, that he said that he thought as a young man he could not write. And so he hurries back to his room. He starts writing this novel. And so they're effectively, the end of volume 7 is really the beginning of volume 1. And so there's a kind of a hermetic circular quality to this narrative, much like James Joyce's Finnegan's Wake, where the end is the beginning and the beginning is the end. And so that's also why I said, when you read the first volume, Swann's Way, when the narrator is telling the events of the story and speaking from the first person perspective, it's hard, really, as you're first beginning the narrative, it's hard to know really who is talking. Is this I that's speaking, this young boy in his bedroom, or is it this more older and mature I, this older and more mature Marcel, who is writing about his experiences. And so what effectively evolves is there are two first person singular narrative perspectives that we find in the narrative as it begins. On the one hand, you have the older and wiser Marcel, who's looking somewhat indulgently at the younger Marcel, who makes mistake after mistake. And so the two eyes that tell the story at the beginning of the narrative seem pretty far apart, but by the time we get to volume 7, they come together as one. And so it's important to remember that, and that may help to orient you into what's going on in the first volume, because when we read the very famous first paragraph, and we're going to look at it in just a minute, you're going to see that the I that's speaking is struggling to come awake and or to come to consciousness after sleeping. And much like all of us, when we wake up and we're in a strange place, we don't know where we are, we're not even sure who we are for a moment because we've been asleep, and so he has to sort of pull himself together in effect. And this is what he does, and then he regains his bearings. So here's a photograph. Proust was very famous for, when he did rush back to start writing this novel, which he felt at last that he could write. He lived in a cork-lined bedroom where he wrote most of the narrative laying in bed, as you see him here laying in his bed writing this narrative. And so there's a funny sense in which all of this action takes place in his bed. It effectively happens in the theater of his mind as he's laying in his bed. Now, there's a German writer, German expressionist writer named Gottfried Benn, who has a novel entitled Journey Around My Bedroom. And that's effectively what takes place, because the action unfolds within the mind of this narrator who's laying in bed and thinking back about his experiences as a small child laying in bed. So here, let me just take a moment, and I'm going to review a few of the key themes in Proust's novel, just to bear in mind. We've already said, first of all, this is a metafictional narrative, has a metafictional theme. This is a book about writing a book. So we have a narrator who doesn't believe in his own ability to write a book, but he finally gets over his lack of self-confidence, and he does write the book. But for a large part of the narrative, the main character, Marcel, doesn't believe he has the talent to write the very book that we are reading as we read this book that he doesn't believe he can write, but he does come to finally find enough self-confidence and strength to write this book. Secondly, the theme of time, temporality, the inevitability of death. And so this is most certainly a novel about time and the discovery of time. And so much like Martin Heidegger, who's writing in Germany around the time of Proust's death and writes his great work Being in Time, which focuses on the theme of time. Proust is himself thinking about time and what time is and how to find time that has been lost. And so there really is a sense in which this is a fervent search for time that has been lost. And Marcel and Proust as well is asking the question, can time that has passed, can it be recovered? Is it possible? This is going to be an interesting theme that he'll pursue. It becomes one of the main themes of the narrative. And then another important theme is, what does it mean to live by metonymy, or to be an I? Now I'm quoting live by metonymy. I'm quoting Roger Shattuck, who also speaks of what he calls Proust's complaint. And so if you're interested in a nice introductory book on Marcel Proust, Roger Shattuck's little book on Proust is a helpful a text that I would recommend. And so text has been around a long, long time. But Shattuck he doesn't razzle dazzle us with too much theoretical stuff. He gives us access to the text, and that's important, I think, for readers first coming to Proust. Now I've had situations in classes where I've taught Proust, and students will say, "Well, I want to do a paper on Deleuze's Proust," the theorist Deleuze, and I always say to students, "Look, read before you come to an appreciation of Deleuze's Proust, or say Theodore Adorno's Proust, or any number, Walter Benjamin, who translated Proust into German, there are any number of really wonderful critical responses to Proust, because he's been so inspiring to so many over the years. But I always say to students, have your own encounter with Proust before you think about having Adorno's or Deleuze's encounter with Proust. Have your own. It's worth it. And so, in any case, Shattuck it would be an exceptional text in that sense, because he doesn't try to provide too much theoretical mediation. He just tries to give suggestions on how to read the text, as I'm doing here. But in any case, one of the things that Shattuck mentions is that one of the themes of the narrative is this idea of living by metonymy. Now, metonymy is a figure of speech in which a part represents the whole. So if you say, for instance, she's a redhead, well, you don't mean that she's just a great big redhead. The metonymy of the redhead stands in for the whole. Now, in the same way, this frail construct that we call the I, first person singular, is it has to represent ourselves, and so it becomes a metonymy for this complex entity that we are. And so this theme of what does it mean to be an I? What is an I? An ego, to put it in the Latin term, is this is something that Proust wrestles with. Now, I might mention also that Proust was influenced by not only Nietzsche, who famously asked, do we still believe in God because we believe in grammar or the first person singular? Proust was also influenced by Freud. This was the early, reception of Freud, and he read both Nietzsche and Freud, and sometimes he has meditations on them. This is also Proust was. The early. And when his texts first appeared, let's say in the context of the rise of surrealism, Dada, and movements like that were taking place in France at the time that his novels were first published, and Proust was, I might note in passing, he was a self-published author. He published his own works. But when his texts were first published, he was greeted with some scorn by figures like André Gide and the surrealists who weren't really, they didn't trust him because of his close association with the wealthy bourgeoisie and the aristocracy. But that cautiousness about Proust very quickly gave way to a celebration when people began to figure out what it was that he was doing. And one of the things that he was doing was like the surrealists, he was influenced by Freud and by the idea of dreams. And as we're going to see in the early passages of Combray, he was also influenced by Freud in the way in which he structures the family drama. There's certainly a very Oedipal dimension to the opening of this narrative, as we'll see. Now, another important theme is the idea of faith or giving credit, belief. And now this is not, now Proust uses, like Joyce and Flaubert, he was raised in a Catholic context, and so he uses the iconography of the Christian Catholic tradition throughout his narrative. But faith, as he refers to it in the narrative, is not really faith in the sense of dogmatic faith in any particular religious tradition, dogmatic religious tradition, although he is describing his childhood growing up in a very French Catholic world. But it's really more about giving credit, having faith, giving credit to the other, and giving credit to oneself. For instance, Nietzsche, here's another sense in which Nietzsche is similar to Proust. Nietzsche said to himself that, he said, I know that when I'm writing today that nobody will understand me. And he said, that's even right. I feel that I don't want to be confused with anybody else. And so he said, I had to write myself a line of credit. And in order for him to produce the philosophy that he produced. And the same really is true with Marcel in this narrative, is that he has to learn to give himself credit. He has to learn to have faith in himself. And as the narrative progresses, we see that he begins to reflect upon that one of the differences between his childhood and his adult years is that he actually, as a child, he believed in the things that he experienced. He gave credit to his own experiences, and this is something that he loses as he matures. And then he begins to reflect on the need for the recovery of faith, or the recovery in belief. And as I said previously, when he writes, when this is a metafictional narrative, when he's able to find the strength to write the book that he earlier didn't believe that he could write, part of the reason why he can write it is because now he's able to because he gives credit to himself, or he has faith in himself. Now, that matter of giving credit or having faith is not, strictly speaking, a matter of religious dogmatism. All right, so this is also, Roger Shattuck will speak of this as sort of this phenomenon as Proust's complaint, or quoting Michel de Montaigne, who speaks of soul error, this idea that the inability of young Marcel to give credence to his own experiences precisely because they are his own experiences. It's much like the famous Groucho Marx statement where he said, I don't want to belong to any club that have someone like me as a member. The same is really kind of true of young Marcel, is that precisely because it is his own experience, his own thought, he can't give credence to it, and he has to learn to give credit to himself. Now, finally, I mentioned this already, this theme of the two paths, or the two ways, the Méséglise way, which is the Swann's way, or the way of our church, the path of the sacred, the Guermantes way, the path of social mobility and social climbing. This is another prominent theme in the narrative, which is established in the early passages of the Combray section of the larger narrative. And remember, even though there are 7 novels, it's really finally one novel, one very long novel. Right, let's take a look at the novel's famous first paragraph. Again, we're using the Moncrieff translation. Here's Marcel. For a long time, I used to go to bed early. Sometimes, when I had put out my candle, my eyes would close so quickly that I had not even time to say, I'm going to sleep. And half an hour later, the thought that it was time to go to sleep would awaken me. I would try to put away the book, which I imagined was still in my hands, and to blow out the light. I had been thinking all the time, while I was asleep, of what I had just been reading, but my thoughts had run into a channel of their own, until I myself seemed actually to have become the subject of my book. A church, a quartet, the rivalry between Francois I and Charles V. And I note here, before I go on, I want to note that, again, he is, in effect, the subject of his own book, and he's reflecting on this as he's struggling to come to consciousness and sort of pull himself together. This impression would persist for some moments after I was awake. It did not disturb my mind, but it lay like scales upon my eyes, and prevented them from registering the fact that the candle was no longer burning. Then it would begin to seem unintelligible, as the thoughts of a former existence must be to a reincarnate spirit. The subject of my book would separate itself from me, leaving me free to choose whether I would form part of it or no, and at the same time my sight would return, and I would be astonished to find myself in a state of darkness, pleasant and restful enough for the eyes, and even more, perhaps, for my mind, to which it appeared incomprehensible, without a cause, a matter dark indeed. Now, again, if you're coming to this for the first time, you may look at this paragraph and say, what in the heck is going on? And you have to, much like, young Marcel has to give faith, have faith in himself, or give credit to himself. You have to give credit to Proust. I mean, you have to accept the fact that so many writers and readers have found him a very rewarding read. And so, as you're struggling with these early paragraphs and the way in which his sentences are so long and complex, I would suggest you, suspend your own desire to throw the book down. Be patient with it, because there is indeed something quite complex that's going on, and it becomes clearer and clearer to you as you understand what's happening in the narrative. Now, again, as I said, it's here. He's like all of us who is asleep. He doesn't know if he's asleep. He doesn't know if he's awake. He's struggling to come to consciousness. He can't remember where he is. Is it the old Marcel? Is it the young Marcel? All of this is happening as he's emerging from this, or coming in and out of this dream state into a state of waking consciousness. Here's a picture of the young Marcel Proust, and I took this picture at his home again in Combray. All of these images here come from the house that you can visit of his Aunt Leonie in Combray, or Illiers-Combray. And here you can see what he looked like as a young boy growing up in Combray-Illiers. Very sensitive child who is often quite sick. And one of the themes of the narrative as well that emerges is this sort of constant struggle with trying to maintain his good health. And Proust struggled with maintaining good health throughout his life and died at a pretty young age. Here's the bed where I showed you the cork-lined bed where the older Marcel Proust wrote this wonderful novel. Here is the bed at his home in Illiers-Combray where he grew up, and it's still there. The house is still there. You can tour it, and you can see there it's just a small, little, humble bed. He was a member of his family was a French bourgeois family that had some wealth, but also had even though they had wealth that was acquired through this is the era of mercantile capitalism, late mercantile capitalism, in the emergence of imperial capitalism. But even though they had wealth, they also had a very clear sense of themselves as being members of the middle class. And you see, like, for instance, the aunts of Marcel are very disapproving of Charles Swann, one of the main characters of the narrative, because he seems to be a social climber, and that's something that they find to be Marcel Proust will say they have almost a Hindu do of caste, that people should stay in their places. And so Marcel is from this middle class, but he longs to move among the wealthy and the elite. Okay, here's Proust. When a man is asleep, he has in a circle around him the chain of the hours, the sequence of the years, the order of the heavenly host. Instinctively, when he awakes, he looks to these and in an instant reads off his own position on the earth's surface and the amount of time that has elapsed during his slumbers. Or suppose that he gets drowsy in some even more abnormal position, sitting in an armchair, say after dinner. Then the world will fall topsy-turvy from its orbit. The magic chair that he's sleeping in will carry him at full speed through time and space. And when he opens his eyes again, he will imagine that he went to sleep months earlier and in some far distant country. But for me, it was enough if in my own bed my sleep was so heavy as completely to relax my consciousness. For then I lost all sense of the place in which I had gone to sleep. And when I awoke at midnight, not knowing where I was, I could not be sure at first who I was. I had only the most rudimentary sense of existence, such as may lurk and flicker in the depths of an animal's consciousness. So again, you can see here that the influence, again, of Freud, the world of dreams. But who hasn't had this experience? Now, the surrealists, who later would become interested in Proust, thought of themselves as the sleeping philosophers, and thought that what happened in the dream state was just as significant as what happened in the state of our waking consciousness. And so, from his influence of Freud, Proust has the same sense of investing importance or significance in the world of dreams and sleep and what happens in our state of being asleep. Okay, so he writes, I was more destitute of human qualities than the cave dwellers, but then the memory, not yet of the place in which I was, but of various other places where I had lived and might now very possibly be, would come like a rope let down from heaven to draw me out of the abyss of not being. And there's almost an embryonic image from which I could never have escaped by myself. In a flash, I would traverse and surmount centuries of civilization, and out of a half-visualized succession of oil lamps, followed by shirts with turned-down collars, would put together by degrees the component parts of my ego. Okay, well, the ego there, ego is it's a Latin word for I, so the component parts of my I. Very, very interesting. This question, what does it mean to be an I, and how can this frail grammatical construct carry the entirety of who we are as beings in the world? Now, Heidegger, for instance, the German philosopher Heidegger will reject the subjective orientation of a figure like Kant. Will speak of das Sein, which is the being that is there, rather than the I or the subject. And there's something very similar going on here in Proust, that what we call the I or the ego is simply not enough to describe the totality or the entirety of who we are or what we are as beings in the world. And das Sein in Heidegger is sometimes translated as existence, or beings who exist in the world. Now here you see, this is again from Proust's bedroom in Illiers-Combray. And there you see a lamp. This was a magic lamp. And he writes about this magic lamp in the early pages of the narrative. And this is exactly what they look like. This is the very lamp he's describing, in which the lamp shines images on the wall. And when as the young boy, this is of course pre-television, pre-film, or the very early days of film, of Méliès making film. Later, not long after this, but as he's looking at these images, they become very disturbing to him because they make strange, we might say in a Russian formalist sense, ostranение. They make strange his room, and it causes, as a young boy, it causes him great disquiet to see these images reflected on the walls. And he writes about this and about how comforting it is to have the things around him in their secure places, and how habit makes him feel secure. But when the ordinary things that are moved around in his room are dislodged, or at least in this sense imaginatively dislodged with these images, they cause him to feel such anxiety. So let's read what Proust says. He says, perhaps the immobility of the things that surround us is forced upon them by our conviction that they are themselves and not anything else, and by the immobility of our conceptions of them. For it always happened that when I awoke like this and my mind struggled in an unsuccessful attempt to discover where I was, everything would be moving round me through the darkness, things, places, years. And he's trying to figure out where he is. He's trying to figure out what he is, who he is. And so he needs the stability of the fixed objects in his room. The stiffened side underneath my body would, for instance, in trying to fix its position, imagine itself to be lying face to the wall in a big bed with a canopy. And at once I would say to myself, why, I must have gone to sleep after all, and Mama never came to say good night. For I was in the country with my grandfather, who died years ago. Then would come up the memory of a fresh position. The wall slid away in another direction. I was in my room in Madame de Saint-Loux's house in the country. Good heavens, it must be 10 o'clock. Now, for those who've read the narrative more than once, and believe it or not, there are those who have read Proust many times, and certainly more than once, it's very rewarding to come back and read the novel and see how well thought out it is. And this, I just throw this out as one instance. Now, Madame de Saint-Loux, so he's saying it would be if somebody that he knew when he was older, the wife of his good friend Robert de Saint-Loux. And so he realizes, he wakes up, he goes, oh no, I'm not a young boy laying in my house with my parents in Combray. I'm at the house of Madame de Saint-Loux. That's where I am. And so now I'm an adult. But we learn later in this novel, or at least in the opening section of Combray, that Madame de Saint-Loux is in fact the very same person as the daughter of Charles Swann, Gilbert Swann. And as a young boy, before he becomes obsessed with Albertine, his first love, his first crush is Gilbert Swann. He becomes obsessed with Swann's daughter, and as his parents take him on walks along the Méséglise Way or the Swann's Way, he hopes that he can meet her. the daughter of Swann. Later, they just become acquaintances, and she marries a good friend of his. But he's referring to another Gilbert, and this is one of the things that's quite interesting about the narrative. We see the same is true of Swann, is there's not just one Swann. There are several different Swanns, and that emerge at different points in the narrative. And so Madame de Saint-Loup is Gilbert at this position in the novel. He's referring to her, but we're going to see that she's. We don't even find this out until much later in the narrative. I just throw this out as one example because this is one of those things that's very satisfying for readers who come back to the narrative a second time, and then they say, "Oh, well, that's Gilbert," and you see how he's playing around with time and how, again, very well thought out this novel really is and complex. Now, Proust gave the example of once he said he gave the example of if you go to cathedrals, these great cathedrals in these French country towns that took 100 years to build and were built with such love and care. He says you see that in the cathedrals that were built prior to modern electricity and lighting, that you can go up into very obscure corners and you can put a little light there, a torch or a flashlight, and you can see into these corners. And what's interesting is that in these corners that nobody can ever see unless you put a torch to them, that they're constructed with the same care and love as those elements of the cathedral that are front and center. And so the same really is true of Proust novel. I use that as a kind of a metaphor of what he's trying to do as a novelist, to construct an enormous work in which there's nothing in it that doesn't have its place. Everything fits in a particular way. Okay, he says, good heavens, it must be 10 o'clock. They will have finished dinner. I must have overslept myself in the little nap which I always take when I come in from my walk with Madame de Saint-Loup before dressing for the evening. For many years have now elapsed since the Combray days, when coming in from the longest and latest walks, I would still be in time to see the reflection of the sunset glowing in the panes of my bedroom window. It is a very different kind of existence at Tansonville now with Madame de Saint-Loup, and a different kind of pleasure that I now derive from taking walks only in the evenings. So as a young boy, he obsessively dreams about coming across Gilbert Swann along the Méséglise way. As an older man, he does this every day, and it's not much of a big deal. But it's the same one and the same person who's also two very different people. Custom. Now, in the Kilmartin version translates custom here as habit. I think that's probably, that would be a translation I would prefer, habit, but custom works. Custom. That skillful but unhurrying manager who begins by torturing the mind for weeks on end with her provisional arrangements, whom the mind, for all that, is fortunate in discovering. For without the help of custom, it would never contrive by its own efforts to make any room seem habitable. So it's habit, custom, that makes us feel that we're at home. Certainly I was now well awake. My body had turned about for the last time, and the good angel of certainty had made, and of course certainty is this Cartesian certainty, but it's a kind of a false certainty as well. The good angel of certainty had made all the surrounding objects stand still, had set me down under my bedclothes in my bedroom, and had fixed approximately in their right places, in the uncertain light, my chest of drawers, my writing table, my fireplace, the window overlooking the street, and both the doors. Someone had had the happy idea of giving me, to distract me on evenings when I seemed abnormally wretched, a magic lantern which used to be set on top of my lamp while we waited for dinner time to come. In the manner of the master builders and glass painters of Gothic days, it substituted for the opaqueness of my walls an impalpable iridescence, supernatural phenomenon of many colors, in which legends were depicted, as on a shifting and transitory window. Riding at a jerky trot, Golo, his mind filled with an infamous design, issued from the little three-cornered forest, which dyed dark green the slope of a convenient hill, and advanced by leaps and bounds towards the castle of poor Geneviève de Brabant. This castle was cut off short by a curved line, which was in fact the circumference of one of the transparent ovals in the slides, which were pushed into position through a slot in the lantern. So these images, like of Golo, for instance, they're riding through his room, and it's exciting, but it's also disconcerting for this. Remember, this is the consciousness of a young and very anxious child, very nervous child. Here you can see these slides which would have gone into the magic lantern, which would have created these images on the wall that the young Marcel finds so disconcerting and wonderful at the same time. I cannot express the discomfort I felt at such an intrusion of mystery and beauty into a room which I had succeeded in filling with my own personality, until I thought no more of the room than of myself. The anesthetic effect of custom or habit being destroyed, I would begin to think and to feel very melancholy things. He's a very, again, nervous, depressive child as well. Now, here's where the theme of the family drama enters into play, and I'd like to focus on this for just a minute. This is some of the most important passages in Proust where this Freudian theme emerges. And here, the theme is very simple. It's about a little boy who wants to give his mother a kiss goodnight and is not able to because they're entertaining that night guest, and that guest is Charles Swann, who's come to visit. And so he's forced to go to bed without giving his mother a kiss goodnight. Now let's also bear in mind that although Marcel Proust had read Freud at this time, that these were very. Now we think of the Oedipal complex, and it's something that's so widely known. But at the time, this was a really new kind of idea or new way of thinking. And Marcel Proust is very explicitly working with these Freudian themes in this narrative. But they also there's clearly an autobiographical dimension to this, to what takes place as well. So he writes, "After dinner, alas, I was soon obliged to leave Mamma, who stayed talking with the others in the garden if it was fine, or in the little parlor where everyone took shelter when it was wet. My sole consolation when I went upstairs for the night was that Mamma would come in and kiss me after I was in bed. But this good night lasted for so short a time. She went down again so soon that the moment in which I heard her climb the stairs, and then caught the sound of her garden dress of blue muslin, from which hung little tassels of plaited straw rustling along the double-doored corridor, was for me a moment of the keenest sorrow. So much did I love that good night that I reached the stage of hoping that it would come as late as possible, so as to prolong the time of respite during which Mamma would not yet have appeared. Sometimes, when after kissing me, she opened the door to go, and I longed to call her back, to say to her, 'Kiss me just once again.' But I knew that then she would at once look displeased, for the concession which she made to my wretchedness and agitation in coming up to me with this kiss of peace always annoyed my father, who thought such ceremonies absurd, and she would have liked to try to induce me to outgrow the custom of having her there at all, which was a very different thing from letting the custom grow up of my asking her for an additional kiss." Now, this is a story that I think all of us can understand. I'll give you one example of this. Years ago, one of my boys saw these large books on my bookshelf and asked me. He was 4 or 5. He said, "Well, what is that?" I said, "Well, how in the world can I explain Proust to a 4 or 5-year-old child?" And then I thought, well, this is a story about a young boy who wants his mother to give him a kiss goodnight. And she can't because she's busy with guests. And that was something that even a 4 or 5-year-old child could understand. And this is what is one of the wonderful things about Proust's novels. It deals with such primordial themes that we can all identify with them. And so this is a young boy who's very attached to his mother and is struggling to detach from her and to individuate. And in some sense, this is a narrative about individuation, which implies separation. And so he is learning to separate from his mother, and he's having a hard time with this. Here you can see a picture of Madame Adrienne Proust, who lived from 1849 to 1905, and her husband, Professor Adrien Proust, who lived from 1834 to 1903. These were the parents of Marcel Proust. I took these photos at his home at the home of Aunt Leonie that became the Proust family home in Illiers-Combray. I might note that the picture of Madame Proust was taken in the last year of her life. So she's much older than the Madame Proust that's being described, or the mother that's being described in this narrative. And again, we want to be careful not to conflate the actual Marcel Proust with the Marcel in the narrative, but clearly there are resonances. Here's Marcel Proust's brother, who lived from 1873 to 1935, Robert Proust. I mention him because what's interesting about Robert Proust is that he appears nowhere in the narrative. He was an important presence in Marcel Proust's life, but in a way he's simply erased from the narrative. This may tell us something further about the Oedipal dimensions of the text. But Proust did have a brother, but his brother appears nowhere in the narrative. Marcel appears to be an only child. Here's Marcel Proust. He says, even the simple act which we describe as seeing someone we know. He's talking here. Let me just preface this by saying he's talking now about the arrival of Monsieur Swann. And when Charles Swann arrives, again, Swann is this figure, this mercurial figure, who is very well received in high society, but his family treat him with some, they're very condescending towards him because they know him and they know his father, and they think he's just some ordinary person, when in fact he's not an ordinary person at all, at least not in the eyes of high society or the aristocracy. And so we see this introduces this theme again of how there's not just one Charles Swann, there's not just one Marcel, there's not just one Gilbert Swann. There are many different Swanns that we ourselves construct. And so Proust is going to very famously say that our personality is our social personality is the construction of others. Others construct the vision or an image of us who they think that we are, and this takes place in all of our relationships. This is Proust's suggestion. So he says, even the simple act which we describe as seeing someone we know is to some extent an intellectual process. We pack the physical outline of the creature we see with all the ideas we have already formed about him. And in the complete picture of him we compose in our minds, those ideas have certainly the principal place. In the end, they come to fill out so completely the curve of his neck, to follow so harmoniously the line of his nose. They blend so harmoniously in the sound of his voice that these seem to be no more than a transparent envelope, so that each time we see the face or hear the voice, it is our own ideas of him which we recognize and to which we listen. So this is really interesting, because we also see how, for instance, when some tidbit comes up that presents to Marcel's aunts an image of a swan that does not conform with the image of swan that they have. They don't know what to do with it. It disrupts this very comfortable image of swan that they have constructed in their own imagination. But Proust's point is that we all do this in our relationship with others, and so we're all jarred by discongruent elements that we come across that don't fit into the composite image of the figure that we've created, which is in effect a figure of our own imagination of those people whom we know. And so, no doubt, from the swan they had built up for their own purposes, my family had left out in their ignorance. Our friend's bodily frame had been so well aligned with the sense and with various earlier memories of his family that their own special swan had become to my people a complete and living creature, so that even now I have the feeling of leaving someone I know for quite another different person when, going back in memory, I pass from the swan whom I knew later and more intimately to this early swan, much like the Gilbert Swann and the Madame de Saint-Loup. This early swan in whom I can distinguish the charming mistakes of my childhood and who incidentally is less like his successor than he is like the other people I knew at that time, as though one's life were a series of galleries in which all the portraits of any one period had a marked family likeness, the same, so to speak, tonality. So let's note here that, again, we have the two I's speaking. So we have the young I, the young Marcel, who's very disconcerted by the arrival of Swann because it means that he's not going to get his goodnight kiss from his mother. But then we have this older, more mature I who's speaking, who knows Swann in these other contexts. And so the young Marcel knows this other Swann. The older Marcel knows these other Swanns whom he meets when he becomes a mature adult. And so he refers to both. And so again, we've got these two I's speaking, and this is something to keep in mind. This may help us to understand, what's happening in the references that are taking place at this juncture in the novel, when the two I's seem so far apart from one another. This early Swann, abounding in leisure, fragrant with the scent of the great chestnut tree, of baskets of raspberries, and of a sprig of tarragon. And there's Charles Haas, who lived from 1833 to 1902. He's often said to be the person who was the inspiration for the figure of Charles Swann in Swann in Love. But now here we return to the young Marcel, the young I who's speaking. It says, but the only one of us in whom the prospect of Swann's arrival gave rise to an unhappy foreboding was myself. This is the young Swann. The young Marcel. And that was because on the evenings when there were visitors or just Monsieur Swann in the house, Mama did not come up to my room. I did not at that time have dinner with the family. I came out to the garden after dinner, and at 9 I said good night and went to bed. But on these evenings I used to dine earlier than the others, and to come in afterwards and sit at table until 8 o'clock, when it was understood that I must go upstairs. That frail and precious kiss, which Mama used always to leave upon my lips when I was in bed and just going to sleep, I had to take with me from the dining room to my own, and to keep inviolate all the time that it took me to undress, without letting its sweet charm be broken, without letting its volatile essence diffuse itself and evaporate. So again, he has to kiss his mother downstairs. He would much rather be laying in bed, get that kiss, and then he could drift off to a comfortable sleep. And so he has to somehow keep it sacred until, all the way in the movement from going downstairs to upstairs to his bedroom. Again, he's a very sensitive, anxious child. Now here is a view from the room of Marcel. I showed you the bed earlier. This is what it looked like. And so if you were to look out from that window, you would see down into the garden, and this would be the garden where his parents would be greeting Monsieur Swann. And so as a child, he could look out that window and see what was taking place, transpiring in the garden directly below his room. There's another angle. This is the actual garden itself from another angle of the house of Aunt Leonie, which again is still there in Illiers-Combray. You can visit it. And I'd been reading Proust for years before I actually visited this site. And I think the one thing that surprised me about it was how small and homely it was. I think I had a more grandiose vision in my mind from reading the narrative. It's very homely, very small, very cozy type of house. There's this is also a room off of the garden. It's in the same vicinity. Here's an image of the kitchen where Françoise, the maid, would make his wonderful dinners for him, often of asparagus. It becomes another theme of the early narrative. And it's very small, and it's just right there in the midst of the rest of the house. Marcel Proust writes, I never took my eyes off my mother. This is when he's being sent up to his room. I knew that when they were at table, I should not be permitted to stay there for the whole of dinner time, and that Mama, for fear of annoying my father, would not allow me to give her in public the series of kisses that she would have had in my room, or that she would have in my room. But tonight, before the dinner bell had sounded, my grandfather said with unconscious cruelty, The little man looks tired. He'd better go up to bed. Besides, we are dining late tonight. And my father, who was less scrupulous than my grandmother or mother in observing the letter of a treaty, went on, "Yes, run along to bed with you." I would have kissed Mamma then and there, but at that moment the dinner bell rang. "No, no, leave your mother alone," this is his father speaking. "You've said good night quite enough. These exhibitions are absurd. Go on upstairs." Now, there we have the Freudian theme. So he's banished and he doesn't even get his kiss. This is terrible for him. Now he can't even get, he was already disappointed, but the thought of getting this kiss he'd have to preserve with him and take with him to his bedroom, now he's not even getting that. And so he's getting really upset now. And so I must set forth without my viaticum. This is like the communion wafer. I must climb, which he's comparing his mother's kiss to, must climb each step of the staircase against my heart, as the saying is, climbing in opposition to my heart's desire, which was to return to my mother, since she had not, by her kiss, given my heart leave to accompany me forth. That hateful staircase, up which I always passed with such dismay, gave out a smell of varnish which had to some extent absorbed, made definite, and fixed the special quality of sorrow that I felt each evening. So note the emphasis on the sense of smell. This is going to be another important dimension of the narrative, is how important smell is and what smell can physiologically do to us and how it can affect our memory, for instance. So even the smell of the varnish as he's going up the stairs is a depressing smell because it means he's banished from his mother. This is that very staircase he's describing. You see that in the image on the left. And then on the right, you can see a larger image of what you also see on the left of the family drawing room or the parlor. So this was the humble staircase that he would have to ascend each night to go alone to his bedroom. As for the agony through which I had just passed, I imagined that Swann would have laughed heartily at it if he had read my letter and guessed its purpose. Now, this is the letter. He sends his mother a letter saying that she must come up and give him a kiss. Whereas on the contrary, as I was to learn in due course, a similar anguish had been the bane of his life for many years. And no one perhaps could have understood my feelings at that moment so well as himself. So I note here what's going on here is he thinks that Swann would laugh at him for his foolish letter that he sends to his mother after he's banished to his room saying he wants a kiss. But in fact, Swann would not have laughed at all because Swann is very much like Marcel, and he goes through very similar sufferings and agonies. And so he's saying here, this Swann would have sympathized with me. And so we get here foreshadowed also what we're going to see in the narrative of Swann in Love, how Swann's struggles are also the story of Marcel and akin to the struggles of Marcel. To him, to Swann, that anguish which lies in knowing that the creature one adores, in Swann's case, is the woman he loves, Odette, named, incidentally, this is not coincidentally linked to the famous ballet in which Odette is also, Swan Lake, is also looms large. The creature one adores is in some place of enjoyment where oneself is not and cannot follow. To him, Swann, that anguish came through love, to which it is in a sense predestined, by which it must be equipped and adapted. But when, as had befallen me, such an anguish possesses one's soul before love has yet entered one's life, then it must drift, awaiting love's coming, vague and free without precise attachment. Okay, so what he's saying here is that he's just a young child and he's not fallen in love in the way that Swann has as an adult. He will later. He's going to become even worse than Swann in his obsession for the woman that he loves, Albertine. But this is a prefiguration. The experience he's having with his mother is a prefiguration of what's going to occur much later in his life when he falls in love with women. Then suddenly my anxiety subsided. A feeling of intense happiness coursed through me, as when a strong medicine begins to take effect and one's pain vanishes. And this is where he makes his decision that he's going to get his kiss at all costs. I had formed a resolution. This is why he's happy. I had formed a resolution to abandon all attempts to go to sleep without seeing Mama, and had decided to kiss her at all costs, even with the certainty of being in disgrace with her for long afterwards, when she herself came up to bed. The tranquility which followed my anguish made me extremely alert, no less than my sense of expectation, my thirst for, and my fear of danger. Noiselessly, I opened the window, and I showed you the picture of that window where he's looking down at the party below, and sat down on the foot of my bed, hardly daring to move in case they should hear me from below. I stood there, not daring to move. He was still confronting us, an immense figure in his white nightshirt, crowned with the ink and violet scarf of Indian cashmere, since he had begun to suffer from neuralgia. He used to tie up his head, standing like Abraham in the engraving after Benzo Gonzalez, which Monsieur had given me, telling Sarah that she must tear herself away from Isaac. So let me provide a little context here. So what is happening is that what happens is that young Marcel, when he decides he's going to get this kiss at all costs, he goes out of his room and he stands in the staircase. And his father and mother, they've said goodnight to their guests, and now they're coming upstairs. And his father comes upstairs as well. His mother comes first and sees him standing in the stairwell and says to him, "What are you doing?" She's worried that her husband's going to be really angry because the child is still awake. But he doesn't care. He says, "Give me a kiss. You're going to give me my kiss." But the father, now here we get the more, the Freudian themes are being really more explicitly developed at this point in the narrative when Proust deliberately compares his father, or the father of Marcel, in the narrative to Abraham. After the drawing of Benzo Gonzalez, this is Abraham. This is the Abraham who tears Isaac away from his mother Sarah to take her up the mountain and to kill Isaac, to sacrifice him. So he's utterly terrified of his father, who becomes a kind of an Abrahamic figure, who's a who's a father, a patriarch that is was listening to the command of God to kill his own son, but also the figure who establishes the covenant with God to circumcise. And so this is again linked to the question of circumcision itself, which is obviously a very Freudian theme as well. And there you see this. This is not the image that he's referring to, which is it's been damaged. There aren't many copies of it available that are undamaged. But here's this on the left. You see a Ghazali painting, which is similar. In this case, it's the story of Abraham with Hagar and Ishmael, whom Abraham banishes to the desert. And over on the right, this is not a Ghazali. This is another painter. But you see there, Abraham getting ready to kill Isaac when the angel stops his hand, right as he's getting ready to dig the knife in. And then behind them in the thickets is a ram who will take the place and be sacrificed in place of his son. So this young boy is terrified. He thinks of his father as this Abrahamic figure who's prepared to kill his own son. Very neurotic child, quite obviously, but going through an experience that many children, almost all children, do. It says, "As for my father, whose affection for me was of another kind, I doubt if he would have shown so much courage, for he as soon as he grasped the fact that I was unhappy, he said to my mother, 'Go and comfort him.'" Now this astonishes the young boy, because just when he expects to be, really severely punished by his father, the father says, "Oh, well, I guess he's not well. So you go ahead and go sleep with him. That's fine. I don't need anything." And this, he can't get it. He doesn't, he expected one thing and got another. And the mother is saying to him, "Well, look, we need to establish rules for this child so he can have a regular expectations of what, is going to happen on a night to night basis." But father's more arbitrary. And he says, "Go sleep with them." And so the mother does. Says, "Mama stayed all night in my room, and it seemed to me that she did not wish to mar by recrimination those hours, so different from anything that I had had a right to expect. For when Francoise, now this is the family maid who becomes a major figure in the narrative, who he had wheedled into taking the letter downstairs to his mother, and she's a simple peasant woman, but she's very shrewd in her own ways, and she's wondering, what's wrong with this kid, but when she guessed that something extraordinary must have happened when she saw Mama sitting by my side, holding my hand and letting me cry unchecked. And so she said to her, "But Madame, what is little master crying for?" And his mother replied, "Why, Francoise, he doesn't know himself. It is his nerves. Make up the big bed for me quickly, and then go off to your own room." Now, the narrator, Marcel, tells us, "I ought then to have been happy. I was not. It struck me that my mother had just made a first concession which must have been painful to her, that it was a first step down from the ideal she had formed for me, and that for the first time she, with all her courage, had to confess herself beaten. It struck me that if I had just scored a victory, it was over her, that I had succeeded as sickness or sorrow or age might have succeeded in relaxing her will, in altering her judgment, and that this evening opened a new era, and it must remain a black date in the calendar." And so little Marcel gets what he wants, but it makes him even more unhappy, and he begins to weep uncontrollably because he realizes he shouldn't have done what he did. But now his mom's going to sleep with him and next to him in the bed, and he's happy, but at the same time wretched. The older Marcel now speaks to us. "Many years have passed since that night. The walls of up the staircase, up which I had watched the light of his father's candle gradually climb, was long ago demolished." Well, it wasn't actually. "And in myself too, many things have perished which I imagined would last forever. And new structures have arisen, given birth to new sorrows and new joys, which in those days I could not have foreseen, just as now the old are difficult of comprehension. It is a long time, too, since my father has been able to tell Mama to go with the child. Never again will such hours be possible for me. But of late I have been increasingly able to catch, if I listen attentively, the sound of the sobs which I had the strength to control in my father's presence, and which broke out only when I found myself alone with Mama. Actually, their echo has never ceased. It is only because life is now growing more and more quiet." So again, this is now he's reflecting on, this is a time that has passed, and how can these hours, are they gone for good? Is it possible to recapture them? "The quiet round me, that I hear them afresh, like those convent bells which are so effectively drowned during the day by the noises of the street that one would suppose them to have been stopped forever, until they sound out again through the silent evening air." And I might note that in Combray, the church, which is very close to the house of Aunt Leonie that's being described here, is that the church bells ring all the time. And so one of the defining features of life in this town is the constant sound of the church bells, which he would have heard all while growing up. Now, there's his bed, and there is a novel next to his bed, François Le Champi by George Sand, that his mother is going to read to him. This was a present from his grandmother. It's a birthday present, but she's going to give it to him early, and he's going to read. And this becomes interesting in the sense of how the metafictional theme of the narrative, of a writing about writing, and about the role of literature, about the role of novels, and how this novel itself becomes a kind of a compensation for his sadness. And so we begin to see how, even as a very young child, the act of novel reading was profoundly important to him in social formation, the formation of his own sense of identity. "Mama sat down by my bed. She had chosen François Le Champi, whose reddish cover and incomprehensible title gave it a distinct personality in my eyes and a mysterious attraction. I had not then read any real novel, so this is his first novel. I had heard it said that George Sand was a typical novelist. This prepared me in advance to imagine that François Le Champi contained something inexpressibly delicious. My agony was soothed when his mother reads him this novel. I let myself be borne upon the current of this gentle night on which I had my mother by my side. I knew that such a night could not be repeated, that the strongest desire I had in the world, namely to keep my mother in my room through the sad hours of darkness, ran too much counter to general requirements and to the wishes of others for such a concession as had been granted me this evening to be anything but a rare and casual exception. Tomorrow night I should again be the victim of anguish, and Mamma would not stay by my side. And so it was that for a long time afterwards, when I lay awake at night and revived old memories of Combray, I saw no more of it than this sort of luminous panel sharply defined against a vague and shadowy background, like the panels which a Bengal fire or some electric sign will illuminate and dissect from the front of a building, the other parts of which remain plunged in darkness. Broad enough at its base, the little parlor, the dining room, the alluring shadows of the path along which would come Monsieur Swann, the unconscious author of my sufferings. But since the facts which I should have then recalled would have been prompted only by an exercise of the will, by my intellectual memory, and since the pictures which that kind of memory shows us of the past preserve nothing of the past itself, I should never have had any wish to ponder over this residue of Combray. To me, it was in reality all dead. Okay, so I'm going to conclude this lecture on that note. But this begins with this distinction, this very important distinction that Proust is going to make, and it's going to be introduced in the very next section of the narrative, the beginning of part 2, where he's thinking about the difference between voluntary and involuntary memory. So he's reflecting on the fact that if he tries just as an intellectual, rational exercise to recover the events that he's narrating, it's inadequate to the task. It doesn't quite get him there. It takes something else to jar him into this recovery of time that has been lost. And we're going to see in the next lecture, we'll look at those passages as well to see what becomes the magical key in effect to help him recover